The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song as Natalie Hayes moved through the ICU at Mercy General, her presence so unremarkable that most staff forgot she'd been in the room the moment she left it. She kept her eyes down. She spoke only when spoken to. Her scrubs were pressed with the precision of someone who still made her bed military tight every morning, hospital corners and all. Nobody knew why. Nobody asked. The ICU in Raleigh's Mercy General stretched across the third floor like a ship's spine, 16 beds in a row, each one a small battlefield where the body fought for another day. The smell was always the same, antiseptic layered over something darker, something like copper and iodine, the scent of survival attempts. Natalie had learned long ago that hospitals didn't save people. Hospitals just bought time for people to save themselves. She moved between beds with the efficiency of someone checking vitals on autopilot, but there was nothing automatic about the way her hands worked. When she touched a wrist, her fingers found the pulse rhythm instantly. When she read a monitor, her eyes absorbed not just the numbers but the pattern, the way the line climbed and fell, the story it told in green and gold lead. She could assess a trauma patient in 3 seconds flat, airway, breathing, circulation. Alphabet soup learned in another lifetime. At bed 7, the Navy SEAL lay sedated beneath a web of tubes and lines. 5 bullet wounds from Baghdad. Entry and exit wounds catalogued like punctuation marks on his chest, his abdomen, his right thigh. He'd come in 3 hours ago with blood pouring from every cavity the surgeon could identify and several he couldn't. The surgeons had stopped the bleeding. Now came the waiting game. Would the tissue hold? Would the organs cooperate? Would the body decide that survival was worth the effort? Natalie checked the foredrip running into his left arm, the one with the tattoo. She'd seen it the moment they wheeled him in. Hayes in block letters, military precise, with coordinates underneath. Fallujah. Her eyes had gone still for just a fraction of a second before she turned back to her work. She stared at the tattoo now, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly as she wrote his vitals into the chart. 7 years. 7 years since she'd buried that part of her life in a desert on the other side of the world. 7 years of quiet. 7 years of keeping her eyes down and letting the world assume she was just a nurse, nothing more, nothing worth noticing. She took a measured breath. Checked the 4 line. The dosage seemed slightly elevated, 0.8 milliliters per hour when it should have been 0.6 for a post-op patient with his weight and wound profile. She adjusted it without fanfare, without commentary, her fingers moving with the kind of confidence that came from having done this exact thing 1,000 times in conditions far less sterile than a hospital room. That's when Dr. Hargrove arrived. He came through the ICU doors at 7:43 a.m. like a man entering a kingdom he'd just purchased. New Chief of Surgery at Mercy General. 48 years old, silver at the temples that he probably had styled weekly, a watch on his wrist that cost more than most people's cars. His badge clipped to a shirt that cost more than Natalie's monthly rent. He wore power the way other men wore cologne. It preceded him into the room. The nurses at the station scattered like birds. One dropped a pen. Another straightened papers that didn't need straightening. Hargrove moved through them without acknowledgement, his presence making the air pressure change, the kind of arrival that announced that the rules had just been rewritten and he was the one holding the pen. He began reviewing charts with loud observations about standard slipping and protocols that needed tightening. His voice carried the particular cruelty of someone who'd learned that domination worked better than leadership. He paused at each bed, making notes, occasionally pointing at equipment without asking questions. This was inspection. This was establishment of fiefdom. When he reached bed 7, he pulled the chart with the confidence of a man who never doubted his own competence. He scanned the vitals. He looked at the foredrip. He looked at Natalie, who had just finished adjusting it. Who set this dosage? His voice came out flat, conversational, the way you might ask someone to pass salt. I adjusted it, Dr. Hargrove. Natalie's voice was quiet, deferential, the voice of someone who'd learned that invisibility was safer than visibility. The patient's weight and post-op profile suggested a lower rate would be more appropriate. Hargrove looked at the foredrip. He looked at the chart. He looked at Natalie's name on the adjustment line. His eyes narrowed in a way that suggested she'd just made a mistake, though she hadn't. The chart would show she was right. The medical protocol would back her. But she'd done something far more dangerous than being wrong. She'd corrected him. Not in public, not deliberately, but she'd demonstrated knowledge that contradicted his implicit authority. She'd suggested through a simple adjustment that there existed standards beyond whatever Dr. Hargrove decided were the standards. This was not acceptable. This was a threat disguised as patient care. Return it to standard post-op protocol, he said. Not a question. A command. I'll be implementing new procedures across this unit, and I expect everyone to follow them precisely. No independent adjustments. No creative interpretations. He turned to face her directly. Understood. Yes, doctor. But he didn't move. He stood there, watching her, his eyes calculating something. Natalie had seen that look before, in military debrief rooms when an officer was deciding whether you were reliable or whether you were a problem. Hargrove was making that decision right now. What's your name? Natalie Hayes. He wrote it down on his phone, just the last name, and something in the way he did it felt like the opening move in a very long game. Then he moved on to the next bed, and the next, and by the time he'd finished his inspection of the ICU, the rubber gloves had snapped like gunshots in the silence as he removed them, the sound sharp and final. By 8:15 a.m., Hargrove had called a meeting in the nurses' station. All shifts, all senior staff, mandatory attendance. He stood at the head of the conference table with the confidence of a man who'd already decided everyone here was either loyal or expendable, and there was no third option. This unit has been running without adequate hierarchy, he began, his voice carrying the particular contempt of someone who believed competence flowed from authority rather than the other way around. I'll be implementing new protocols. Every decision runs through me. Every adjustment requires approval. Every treatment follows the exact parameters I establish. He paused. He looked directly at Natalie. I've noticed some staff members believe they're more knowledgeable than the physicians. That ends now. He let that hang in the air. He was building something. He was establishing his empire, and he was establishing it on the foundation of absolute obedience. Then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't involve the eyes. As a matter of fact, I'm making a bet, he said. One of our nurses seems to think she knows better than I do. I'm betting she'll quit within a week. He looked directly at Natalie. Once she realizes that this ICU runs my way or doesn't run at all. No one said anything. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical hum. Somewhere down the hallway, a heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. But the sound that dominated the room was silence, the kind of silence that meant hierarchy had just been established, that someone had just been marked, and that the person who'd marked her had the institutional power to make that mark permanent. Natalie looked down at her hands. She'd held lives together with these hands. She'd carried wounded men through enemy fire with these hands. She'd performed emergency procedures in conditions where a hospital ICU would have seemed like a luxury resort. But in this moment, in front of Dr. Hargrove, they were just the hands of a quiet nurse who kept her eyes down and didn't challenge powerful men. The next morning, Natalie arrived at Mercy General at 6:45, 20 minutes before her shift. The ICU was already humming with its usual chaos, ventilators sighing, monitors beeping their fractured rhythms, the coffee machine gurgling in the break room like a dying animal. She clocked in and moved toward the supply station, her bad leg sending small jolts of pain with each step, a reminder that some injuries never fully heal. Dr. Hargrove was waiting in the cafeteria. She didn't see him at first. She was standing in line, holding a tray, her mind already running through the SEAL patient's medication schedule and vital signs from the night shift report. The lunch line moved slowly. A chicken sandwich. Mixed vegetables. Coffee black. She reached the end of the counter and turned toward a corner table near the window, the only place in the cafeteria where she could sit alone and still see the ICU entrance reflected in the glass. He approached from her left. Hargrove moved like a man who'd never been told no, shoulders squared, eyes locked on her with the intensity of someone preparing for an execution. His white coat billowed behind him like he was parting water. 2 surgeons from the orthopedic team stood near the salad bar, watching. A nurse from pediatrics froze mid-bite of her yogurt. "Careful," Hargrove said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Wouldn't want you to spill." Then his hand came up from his side and knocked her tray clean off the table. The impact was deliberate, calculated. Soup exploded across the tile floor in a scalding arc. The sandwich tumbled, landing face down. The coffee cup shattered, sending a spray of dark liquid across her white shoes and the hem of her scrubs. The sound of breaking ceramic echoed through the entire cafeteria. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Natalie stood motionless for exactly 2 seconds. She looked down at the wreckage. Looked at the soup pooling across the tile, spreading like something alive. Looked at Hargrove's face, which had arranged itself into an expression of theatrical concern, eyebrows raised, mouth slightly open, the picture of innocent surprise. "Oh my God," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see you there. Better clean that up, sweetheart. Wouldn't want anyone to slip." He turned and walked away, his colleagues trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. The other staff members returned to their meals, but the energy in the room had shifted. The silence had texture now. It had weight. Natalie knelt down slowly, her injured leg protesting with a white-hot flash of memory. The tile was cold under her knees. She began gathering the pieces of the cup, one by one, moving with the mechanical precision of someone performing a ritual. Her movements were steady. Her hands didn't shake. A single tear escaped from her left eye, not from pain, not from humiliation, but from the sheer exhaustion of being hunted by a man who held all the institutional power and none of the self-control. She wiped the tear away with the back of her hand before it could reach her cheek. A custodian appeared with a mop and bucket. "I got it, hun, don't worry about it." "Thank you," Natalie said quietly. She stood, collected the broken pieces into a napkin, dumped them in the trash. Walked out of the cafeteria without eating. Without looking back. Without breaking the composure that had kept her alive through 3 deployments in Baghdad. The next day was worse. Hargrove found her in the ICU at 2 in the afternoon, standing at the medication station reviewing the SEAL patients for drip order. She'd corrected the rate from 15 milliliters per hour to 12, a small adjustment that had saved the man's life, though he'd never know it. She'd simply changed it and documented it without comment, the way a competent nurse worked. Quietly. Efficiently. Invisible. Hargrove swept his hand across the counter. 6 patient charts scattered across the tile floor like playing cards. They spiraled and fell in slow motion, landing at her feet in a deliberate heap. Her chart. The SEAL patient's chart. Charts belonging to 3 other patients she was monitoring. The sound of them hitting the ground was like a gunshot in the quiet ICU. "Pick those up, sweetheart," Hargrove said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "Or are you too delicate for actual work?" This time, other nurses had witnessed it. Carter from the night shift stood frozen by the medication dispenser. Rodriguez, a respiratory tech, pretended to examine a ventilator but his shoulders had gone rigid. The SEAL patient was sedated in his room just beyond the glass partition, unaware that his nurse was being systematically dismantled in the hallway outside his door. Natalie knelt again. Picked up the first chart. The second. The third. Her movements were deliberate and slow, not rushed, not angry, not defeated. She picked them up the way a soldier picks up a rifle after cleaning it, with respect and precision. She organized them in order by patient room number. Stood. Made eye contact with Hargrove for the first time since he'd arrived. 1 measured breath. The silence in the ICU was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, that thin, electric buzz that had become the soundtrack to her imprisonment at Mercy General. The monitors beeped. The ventilators wheezed. And then Natalie's voice came out, steady as a surgical laser, quiet enough that only he could hear it clearly but loud enough that the listening nurses caught every syllable. "I've been shot at by better men than you, doctor." She walked away from him. Walked into the SEAL patient's room. Closed the door with a soft click. Hargrove stood alone in the hallway, his face cycling through disbelief and something darker, rage, yes, but underneath it something more dangerous, the recognition that his weapons weren't working. Humiliation required an audience and a victim who performed the part. Natalie had refused both. She'd taken his assault and transmuted it into something his arsenal couldn't touch. He made his phone call that evening. Natalie didn't know about it yet, but the machinery was already in motion. Hargrove had retreated to his office with the door locked, his phone pressed against his ear, his voice low and urgent as he spoke to Martin Castelliano, the board chairman, who was somewhere on the 18th hole of Wildwood Country Club with a martini sweating in his hand. "She's unstable," Hargrove said, each word precisely calibrated. "Insubordinate. Today she spoke to me in a way that was completely inappropriate. I'm concerned about her mental state. I'm recommending a formal investigation." But that was later. In the moment, in the ICU, Natalie simply continued her work. She checked the SEAL patient's vitals every hour on the hour, a dedication that went beyond protocol, beyond duty, beyond even the bounds of professional responsibility. His oxygen saturation was at 96% now. His blood pressure had stabilized at 115/72. His heart rate was steady, holding at 64 beats per minute. These numbers represented a man climbing slowly out of the abyss. She didn't know why she cared so much. Well, that wasn't entirely true. She cared for all her patients. That was the nurse in her, the part that had never left the service, that still believed in the mission of healing. But this patient was different. There was something in his chart that nagged at her, some fragment of memory she couldn't quite access. His name was listed as Lieutenant Marcus Holloway, age 32, admitted with 5 penetrating wounds from small arms fire sustained during a patrol in Baghdad 3 years ago. 3 years. Baghdad. She found herself lingering during her hourly checks, her gaze drifting to his left forearm where the .4 was secured. She noticed something there, ink beneath the surface, black lines that formed shapes she couldn't quite decipher from this angle. A tattoo. She should have made a note of it in his chart, but something stopped her. Some instinct that told her not to look too closely, not to ask questions, not to connect the pieces that were slowly arranging themselves in the back of her mind like a puzzle she didn't want to solve. She adjusted his sedation, checked his chest dressing for bleeding, verified that his Foley catheter was draining clear urine. Everything was stable. Everything was under control. The only thing spiraling was her own position at Mercy General, though she didn't fully understand the magnitude of what was coming. At 2:47 that afternoon, Natalie noticed something had changed in the rhythm of the unit. Administrators who never normally appeared in the ICU started walking past her station with clipboards. A woman she didn't recognize, early 50s, expensive blazer, the kind of presence that spoke of authority, spent 20 minutes reviewing the patient roster and conferencing quietly with Hargrove near the nurse's station. By that evening, Natalie's badge access had been flagged for review. She discovered it when she tried to enter the secure medication room at the end of her shift. The system rejected her scan. The lock stayed sealed. She tried again. Same result. A message flashed on the electronic panel, access restricted pending administrator review. Her stomach tightened. She said nothing to anyone, simply made a note that she would need a nurse supervisor to unlock the room and assist with the final medication count. Later, in the break room, she sat alone with black coffee and stared at nothing. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns, a voice in her head whispered, her own voice, or perhaps the voice of every soldier she'd known who'd made the choice to heal instead of fight. But sitting there in the fluorescent glow, watching the rain begin to fall against the break room windows, she wondered if bravery was just another word for being too tired to run. Her phone buzzed. A text from her 16-year-old son, "You okay, Mom? You're late." She typed back, "Running late. Home soon." The lie came easily. That was the part that worried her most, how easily the lies came now, how natural it felt to hide. She'd built an entire life on secrecy, on being someone other than who she was. And now that structure was crumbling, and she had no idea how to tell her son that the quiet life she'd promised him might be about to explode into pieces. 5 hours after Hargrove's latest humiliation, the monitor began to scream. Natalie was adjusting the seals for line when his heart rate spiked from 88 to 142 in the space of a breath. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and useless, as his blood pressure collapsed like a building demolition, 120/80, then 100/60, then 70/40 and dropping. His skin went grey. Not pale. Grey. The color of a body already halfway gone. She didn't call for help first. She hit the code button and was already moving, hands on his chest, checking his pupils, reading the monitor like a map to his death. The rhythm was sinus but weakening, every beat slower than the last, his heart being strangled inside his own ribcage by something she couldn't see but could already diagnose. Cardiac tamponade. A bullet fragment. Shifted position. Blood filling the pericardial sac like water in a sealed container, crushing the heart from the outside in. She'd seen it once before in Fallujah, a Marine corpsman named Chen with a penetrating chest wound, and she'd held pressure while his heart rate climbed and then flatlined because there was nothing left to pump, just a fist-sized chamber of blood suffocating the organ that was supposed to keep him alive. Not this one. Not again. The code team arrived in 30 seconds, nurses, respiratory, a resident whose name she'd never learned, and they arranged themselves around the bed with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this 300 times. But then Hargrove was there, and the entire room shifted like a ship listing in open water. He stood at the patient's head, not moving, just observing with the expression of a man watching something he'd already written the ending for. "Get me an ultrasound," Hargrove said. Not a question. A command. "We need cardiac confirmation before we proceed with anything invasive." The seal's pressure was 65/38. His oxygen saturation dropped to 89. The heart monitor beeped in a rhythm that sounded like goodbye. "He doesn't have time for ultrasound," Natalie said. Her voice was steady. "He's exsanguinating into his pericardium." "That's a hypothesis," Hargrove replied, and then he turned to the resident. "Get cardiothoracic down here. Tell them we need a surgical consult for possible emergency pericardiotomy." Cardiothoracic was on the 4th floor. The surgical suite was booked. The attending surgeon was in a meeting. The SEAL had 3 minutes, maybe 4, before his heart simply stopped moving because there was nowhere left for it to go. Natalie watched his pressure drop to 60/35. She watched his lips lose color. She watched him stop being a man and start becoming a case study, something to be managed and documented and reviewed in hospital committee meetings while his body cooled on a steel table. Her hands moved. Not trembling. Not hesitating. Moving like they were someone else's hands, someone who had done this before in a field hospital in Anbar province with nothing but a 16-gauge spinal needle and her own judgment and the weight of knowing that if she was wrong, a man died, and if she was right, he lived. She reached for the needle. A 16-gauge spinal needle, long and thin and sharp as a fang. She found the space, below the xiphoid process, below the bottom of his ribcage, the safe zone, the place where the needle could pass through the diaphragm and into the pericardial sac without shredding a lung. "Stop," Hargrove said. Not a shout. Worse. A statement. A law. She positioned the needle at 45 degrees, angled toward his left shoulder, the trajectory burned into her muscle memory from a lifetime ago when she'd worn a uniform and carried a rank and knew more about keeping people alive in catastrophic situations than anyone in this ICU had ever learned in a residency program. "You are not authorized to perform that procedure," Hargrove said. "Step back. Now." The SEAL's heart rate was 38. Dropping. His skin the color of wet concrete. Natalie inserted the needle. The resistance of tissue. The give. the pop as she entered the pericardial sac, a sensation like breaking through ice on a frozen lake, a distinct boundary between inside and outside, alive and nearly dead. She pulled the plunger. 40 milliliters of blood filled the syringe in a dark rush, like the whole terrible truth of his injury drawn out in a single motion. The moment the pressure released, she felt it more than saw it, the SEAL's body relaxing like a fist unclenching, the monitor rhythm rising from 38 to 62 to 89 in the space of 4 heartbeats. His blood pressure climbed. 70 over 40. 85 over 50. 98 over 58. Color returned to his face like someone turning up the saturation on a photograph. His oxygen saturation rose to 97%. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Natalie set down the syringe. The blood looked almost black inside the barrel, backlit by the overhead light. She stripped off her gloves, the sound like a snapped rubber band, loud in the silence, and stepped back from the bed. Hargrove's face had transformed into something she'd never seen before. Not anger. Not even rage. Something deeper. The expression of a man watching his entire carefully constructed authority collapse in real time, watching a quiet nurse perform an unauthorized procedure that violated every protocol in a hospital manual and saved a patient's life while he stood frozen like a statue with a stethoscope. "You just ended your career," he said quietly. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, something massive being held in barely restrained idle. Natalie met his eyes for the first time since the code had started. She held the gaze for exactly 3 seconds, the amount of time it took for him to understand that she didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't ask for permission. "He's alive," she said. She walked out of the ICU. Not running. Not frantic. Walking with her hand steady at her sides, past the nurse's station where everyone was frozen in the aftermath of the code, past the medication cart and the supply closet where she'd hidden her boots in a duffel bag at the bottom of the locker, boots that were marked with the dust of Fallujah and the memory of carrying a patient, this patient, the one she'd just saved, 2 miles through enemy fire while rounds pinged off the rubble around them. The hallway felt different now. Longer. As if every step took her further from the person she'd built and closer to the person she'd buried. She made it to the locker room and closed the door. Sat on the metal bench in front of her assigned locker. The fluorescent light overhead hummed and flickered, and for a moment she was back in the transport helicopter crossing Baghdad at 0400 hours, the rotor wash so loud it felt like the sky was splitting apart, and the SEAL was bleeding through the field dressing on his shoulder and asking her name, and she'd told him, the only person she'd told in 3 years, the only person who needed to know. Within 2 hours, Hargrove had activated his entire network. A call to the hospital board chairman during his golf game. Contact with her references at the nursing school. An external investigator brought in to review her credentials, painting her as a reckless vigilante who had violated protocol, who had performed an unauthorized invasive procedure without physician approval, who had endangered a patient regardless of outcome. The outcome didn't matter. Protocol mattered. Authority mattered. The chain of command, and Natalie's decision to break it in the most public way possible, on a monitor that half the ICU had watched, with a doctor whose entire identity was built on never being questioned. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what she didn't say. The worst part was walking out of that hospital knowing that she could explain everything, the SEAL's vitals, the timeline, the impossibility of waiting, the medical reality of cardiac tamponade in the critical window where intervention could save a life. She could explain all of it. She could open her mouth and say the words that would make clear that she'd made the only choice available in that moment. Instead, she packed a cardboard box. Her badge. A cracked mug from the nurse's break room that said "World's Okayest Nurse." A succulent that had been dying for 6 months. A photograph of her team in desert fatigues, standing in front of a blown-out school building in Fallujah, all of them 18 years old in the places that mattered, faces already shaped by things no 22-year-old should see. The security guard was kind about it. He handed her the box and didn't make eye contact, and she recognized in that small gesture the size of what had happened, the moment when a quiet nurse became a person to be processed out, to be removed, to be disappeared into the machinery of institutional protection that had decided she was the problem. She stood in the rain on the corner of Fayetteville and Martin Luther King Boulevard, holding a cardboard box, wondering if the seal would survive the night, wondering if he'd make it to consciousness, wondering if any of it would matter in the equation that her life was becoming. The rain came down like applause for a performance no one wanted to see. The rain hammered against Hargrove's office window like a fist demanding entry. He sat at his desk at 11:48 p.m., the hospital corridor silent except for the ventilator rhythms drifting through the walls, and he began to make calls. First was Chairman Whitmore at his country club in Chapel Hill. Hargrove didn't apologize for the hour. "We have a serious liability situation," he said, voice tight with practiced concern. "One of my nurses performed an unauthorized invasive procedure. Cardiac puncture. Protocol violation, unauthorized administration of anesthesia, failure to notify attending." Whitmore's voice crackled back, confused. "Which nurse?" Hargrove let the silence hang for 3 beats. "Natalie Hayes. She's been flagged before for insubordination. I've kept it documented." A lie wrapped so tightly it didn't even look like one. By midnight, Hargrove had called the hospital's legal counsel, Marcus Brennan, who arrived within the hour with 2 investigator contacts already on speed dial. "This is straightforward liability," Hargrove explained, his voice the smooth oil of institutional competence. "She acted without authorization. No physician's order. No consent documented. The patient coded and she inserted a needle directly into his pericardium. If he'd bled out internally, we're looking at wrongful death litigation." He slid across a printed incident report, already filled out in his own handwriting with specific times and violations. Brennan's jaw tightened as he read. "Do we have her medical credentials?" "That's where it gets interesting," Hargrove said, and there was something in his voice that made Brennan look up. "Her employment application lists nursing school only. No prior medical experience. But her technique, I've seen surgical residents hesitate on that procedure. She moved like she'd done it before." By 2 a.m., Hargrove had called 3 board members at home. By 3:15 a.m., the investigator had accessed Natalie's file and found the inconsistency Hargrove had planted the suggestion to find. Her nursing school transcript was legitimate. Her certifications were clean. But the absence of prior experience listed alongside demonstrated surgical-level competency created exactly the kind of gap that investigators are trained to see as suspicious. Falsification of credentials. Deliberate concealment. At 4:56 a.m., the hospital's chief medical officer received a call recommending immediate termination before sunrise. Not for saving a life. For breaking protocol. For being, in the language they would use, a reckless vigilante operating beyond her scope of practice. The fluorescent lights in human resources burned with the particular brightness of institutional punishment. Natalie sat across from Margaret Chen, the HR director, at 7:03 a.m. on a Tuesday that felt like a courthouse conviction. Margaret's hands trembled as she read from the termination letter. Gross violation of medical protocols. Failure to disclose background relevant to your position. Unauthorized invasive procedure without physician oversight. Margaret's voice was apologetic, which somehow made it worse. Dr. Hargrove has documented a pattern of insubordination and safety concerns. The board has decided this morning that Natalie's badge deactivated with a click. Not a dramatic gesture. Just the sound of access being revoked. Margaret slid it across the desk. Your employment with Mercy General is terminated effective immediately. Security arrived, the same guard, James, who had smiled at her every morning for 2 years, who had complimented her scrubs, who had asked about her quiet life. His face was locked into the neutral expression of a man following orders. "I'll need to escort you to collect your personal items," he said, and those words transformed him into a different person. The walk through the ICU felt like walking through a museum of her own life. Nurses she'd trained looked away. The SEAL patient's monitor beeped in his room, strong rhythm, steady rate, O2 saturation climbing toward normal, alive because of her hands on a needle. She could see Hargrove through his office window, arms crossed, watching with the expression of a man who had just won a war he'd declared unilaterally. Her locker was in the staff room on the second floor. She opened it and found the pieces of her anonymous life, a cracked ceramic mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a dying succulent she'd been forgetting to water for 3 weeks, and a photograph in a plastic frame. 12 people in desert fatigue standing in front of a medical tent, the structure barely visible behind the dust storm that was trying to erase them from history. Dr. Sarah Chen on the left, a surgeon who could do miracles with nothing but gauze and will. Corpsman Marcus Torres, tattoo visible on his bicep, the man who'd held the 4 bag during the ambush. Captain William Hayes, her brother, now dead 6 years, standing in the center with his arm around her shoulders. All of them dead except her. All of them gone from a mortar round that had turned a medical tent into a tomb. She pushed the boots aside and reached for them. Tan leather, salt-stained, the laces still knotted in a way she'd tied them 3 years ago. They were wrapped in plastic that had begun to yellow. She'd kept them in the back of the locker since she'd started at Mercy General, a weight she carried without anyone knowing what the weight was. James waited by the door, not making eye contact. She put everything into the cardboard box they'd given her, the mug, the succulent, the photograph, and the boots in their cracking plastic. The box weighed almost nothing, which seemed wrong. A career shouldn't be so light. The rain hit her like a judgment as she walked to the bus stop on the corner of Fayetteville and Martin Luther King Boulevard. Her jacket was thin, designed for hospital climate control, not weather. Water soaked through her scrubs, cold against her skin, and she sat on the bench under the shelter that did nothing to stop the diagonal assault of the storm. The box sat beside her, getting damp. She opened it once, just enough to see the photograph. Her hands didn't shake. That was the training. That was the discipline she'd carried for 16 years, the ability to remain steady while the world reorganized itself around her. But something in her chest felt like it was collapsing inward, like her lungs were forgetting how to expand. The secret had been simple: stay invisible, stay quiet, let no one ask questions about the scars or the nightmares or why loud noises made her move like a threat was incoming. She'd chosen this small life in Raleigh deliberately, a nursing job where no one cared about her past, where she could help people without being close enough to destroy them again. She'd been shot at in Baghdad. She'd bled in Fallujah. She'd held the hand of a man as he died because there wasn't enough blood to keep his heart beating. She'd left the service because the PTSD had become a weapon pointing at everyone around her, the way she'd flinch at doors slamming, the way she'd wake up moving for her rifle, the way she'd started seeing threat in every shadow. So she'd buried Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes in a cemetery somewhere between Helmand Province and here, and she'd tried to become someone else. Someone ordinary. Someone small. The bus arrived at 8:14 a.m. Its doors hissed open like machinery coming to life, and the driver waited. Natalie looked at the box in her lap, at the photograph barely visible through the water damage, at the boots wrapped in cracking plastic. She looked at the hospital across the street, at the windows where surgeons were already working on new emergencies, at the ICU where a Navy SEAL was probably waking up and wondering why he survived, at the 5th-floor office where Hargrove was probably pouring his first coffee of victory. She didn't get on the bus. Something in her locked into place, not fear, not indecision, but the particular stillness that comes before detonation. She set the box down on the bench and pulled out her phone, the one she'd kept for 3 years that nobody knew existed. The one with a single contact in the encrypted directory. She opened it. It took her 7 seconds to compose the message: Hargrove. Mercy General. Raleigh. Tell them I'm alive. The message went to a number that had no name attached, a line that was monitored by people who lived in a different kind of darkness than she did. A line that was picked up at the Defense Intelligence Agency's Operations Center by a woman named Lieutenant Commander Sarah Reeves, who'd been her medical corps officer in Fallujah, who'd recommended her for the Navy Cross, who'd sworn that if Natalie ever needed anything at all, the call would be answered. Natalie hit send at 8:17 a.m. The phone rang back at 8:23 a.m. Senior Chief. Just that. Reeves's voice like a weapon being drawn from its holster. Sit rep. The military word for situation report. The word that meant Natalie was no longer a nurse in a cardboard box at a bus stop. The word that meant she was operational again. Reeves, I need to make something very clear. Natalie's voice had changed. The tremor was gone. The careful deference was gone. What remained sounded like someone who'd been asleep and was just now opening her eyes. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm calling in the marker. SEAL Team 3. Someone's injured. Someone saved me in Baghdad. Hargrove just made a mistake he's going to spend the rest of his life understanding. There was a pause on the line so brief it was almost not there. Commander Price is already in North Carolina, Reeves said. He was flying into Cherry Point this morning. He's got 13 minutes by Black Hawk to your location. Give me the address. The rain continued to fall around her. The cardboard box sat on the bus bench getting soaked. The photograph inside was becoming illegible, the image dissolving into abstraction, into history, into the thing she'd tried so hard to bury that it had come back around and destroyed her anyway. But Natalie wasn't sitting on a bench anymore. She was standing now, boots planted on wet concrete, phone against her ear, and the woman speaking into the phone wasn't a quiet nurse anymore. She was what she'd always been underneath the scrubs and the silence. She was a warrior. The lobby doors at Mercy General burst open at 0600 hours, and the sound of boots on marble echoed through the atrium like a drum line, organized, rhythmic, unstoppable. 17 Navy SEALs in dress uniforms moved through the entrance in formation, their faces carved from granite, their bearing the kind of quiet authority that made security guards step aside without being asked. At their head walked Commander Price, his shoulders wide enough to block the morning light streaming through the glass, his presence making the air itself seem to compress. Behind them came a boy, 16 years old, dark hair, Natalie's eyes, carrying a shadow box. The medals inside caught the fluorescent overhead lights, gold, silver, ribbon, insignia. He walked like he was carrying something holy. The reception desk nurse looked up from her computer and froze. The SEAL team didn't stop at the information desk. They moved deeper into the lobby, their dress uniforms a wall of navy blue and gold, their dress shoes striking the floor in unison, tap, 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 a cadence that made every head turn. A maintenance worker mopping the corner suddenly found his hands trembling. An orderly pushing a medication cart pulled it aside as if the room itself was shrinking. Natalie's son walked to the reception desk and set the shadow box down carefully on the polished surface. His voice cracked when he spoke. Mom, they need to see these. The receptionist's hands moved to her mouth. Commander Price stepped forward, and his voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Not loud. Just precise. Absolute. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Every person in that lobby heard it. The title hung in the air. Senior Chief. Petty Officer. The medical staff froze mid-step. A nurse in the ICU corridor dropped her clipboard. The sound it made hitting the tile, sharp, final, seemed to crack something open in the building itself. In the ICU, Natalie turned. Her hand stilled on a medication cart. She'd been moving through her shift with the rhythm she'd perfected over months, check vitals, document, move, repeat. Invisible. Exactly how she'd planned it. She walked toward the lobby. By the time she arrived, a trembling nurse, the same one who'd processed her termination paperwork yesterday, had found Natalie's personnel file in the system. The file that had been classified, sealed, buried under so many layers of security protocols that even the hospital's HR director needed approval to access it. The nurse's voice was barely audible as she read it aloud. 2 purple hearts. She paused. Her eyes widened. Navy Cross. Dr. Hargrove emerged from the elevator at that exact moment, his expression still carrying that smirk, the one that had haunted the ICU for weeks. He'd come down to see the situation himself, certain he could manage whatever civilian complaint had materialized. His mouth opened to speak. But he stopped. Because the voice of the trembling nurse continued, and each word seemed to pull the color from his face like someone draining a bathtub. Bronze Star with Valor. Silver Star. Presidential Unit citation for the rescue of 12 Marines under fire in Baghdad. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. That has presence. The SEAL team remained at perfect attention. Natalie stood motionless, watching the shock ripple through the building like shock waves from a distant explosion. She didn't smile. Her hands didn't shake. The transformation was already complete, the quiet nurse was gone. What remained was the woman who'd survived Fallujah, who'd carried a wounded Marine 2 miles through enemy fire, who'd made decisions that saved lives when everyone around her was making choices based on ego and institutional politics. From across the lobby, the SEAL patient, the man Natalie had saved twice, once in the desert and once in the ICU, was wheeled out of the elevator by an orderly. He was awake now, his eyes clear, his body already beginning the long road back to strength. The orderly started to direct the wheelchair to the side, following the obvious traffic pattern of the lobby. The SEAL patient shook his head. He wheeled himself forward with his good arm, moving directly toward the cluster of uniforms, toward the shadow box, toward the woman standing at the center of it all. When he reached Natalie, he gripped her hand. His voice was rough, still carrying the gravel of sedation and oxygen deprivation. "You carried me out of Fallujah." It wasn't a question. Natalie's grip tightened just slightly. She didn't speak. The man lifted his left forearm, and there it was, her name, tattooed in block letters across skin that had been burned by desert sun and sewn back together by field surgeons. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, it read. 3 years he'd carried that mark, searching military records, trying to find the woman whose name was etched into his arm, the woman he'd never gotten to thank. "You saved my life twice," he said. Behind him, Dr. Hargrove's smirk had drained away completely. His face had gone a shade of white that suggested his blood pressure had just made a sudden descent. His hands were at his sides, and they weren't steady anymore. The elevator he'd stepped out of seemed very far away. Commander Price turned slightly, acknowledging Hargrove with a glance, just a glance, nothing more, but that glance contained everything. Every bit of institutional authority, military precision, and the cold clarity of a man who'd spent 2 decades separating truth from fiction. "Dr. Hargrove," Commander Price said, his voice still calm, still precise, but now carrying an edge like winter. "I believe you have some things to discuss with the hospital board." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Before Hargrove could respond, before he could mount any defense, the same security guard who'd escorted Natalie out of the building yesterday appeared at his side. His name was Marcus. He'd been working security at Mercy General for 11 years, and he'd witnessed what Hargrove had done to that quiet nurse. He'd handed her the cardboard box with her personal items and watched her walk out into the rain. He'd carried that shame for 24 hours. Marcus held another cardboard box, identical to the one he'd given Natalie. He extended it toward Hargrove, and his voice was flat, professional, the voice of someone performing a duty that had become necessary. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor." Hargrove's hands trembled as he took the box. The ICU staff had gathered now, standing in the corridor that overlooked the lobby. Nurses, residents, attending physicians, orderlies. They watched in silence as Dr. Hargrove, the man who'd run the ICU like a fiefdom, who'd made a public bet that Natalie would quit, who'd thrown her charts at her feet and knocked her cafeteria tray to the floor, walked toward the exit with his cardboard box. His career wasn't ending. It was already over. Everyone watching understood that the moment Commander Price had spoken those 7 words, Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. The Navy SEALs remained at attention until Hargrove disappeared through the lobby doors. Then they turned in unison to face Natalie. What happened next couldn't be called a celebration, because it was too formal, too precise for that. But it was something more than recognition. It was acknowledgement. It was the moment when institutional reality collapsed and replaced itself with actual truth. 6 months passed. Dr. Hargrove taught CPR fundamentals at Raleigh Community College for $18 an hour, his medical license suspended pending a formal investigation. The investigation found 14 instances of documented retaliation against hospital staff and 3 separate cases where patient outcomes had been compromised by decisions made in his own institutional interest rather than the patient's. The story leaked. The local news covered it. He became a cautionary tale about what happens when authority becomes disconnected from purpose. Meanwhile, Mercy General's boardroom had been reconfigured. The table was longer now. The light was better. And at the head of it, standing in her nursing scrubs with her hair back in a military braid, something she'd started doing again since the SEAL team arrived, stood Natalie Hayes. On the polished wood of the table, placed where everyone could see them, were her combat boots. The same pair she'd hidden in her locker for 3 years. The leather was scuffed. The laces were worn. There was still a trace of Baghdad dust in the treads, dust that no amount of cleaning could fully remove. The board chairman read the resolution in a voice that carried something like pride. Director of Emergency Medicine, effective immediately. Behind Natalie stood 7 members of SEAL Team 3 in their dress uniforms. The patient she'd saved twice was among them, no longer in a wheelchair, now standing with a cane, but standing. Her son sat in the front row, the shadow box of medals on his lap, his eyes shining with a kind of recognition that only comes when a child finally understands who their parent actually is. Natalie picked up the combat boots. She held them for a moment, just a moment, feeling the weight of them, the history compressed into leather and rubber. She set them back down. "These stay here," she said, her voice steady, commanding, no longer the voice of the invisible nurse. "So I remember who I was, and why I do this." The SEAL saluted. She returned it, the movement automatic, muscle memory flooding back through 3 years of careful suppression. Arm bent, hand pressed to temple, the gesture that acknowledged more than words could carry. The meeting ended. Staff filtered out. The board chairman shook her hand. The SEAL commander nodded, a gesture of respect between peers who'd both served. But the SEAL patient remained. He approached slowly, using his cane, his body still rebuilding itself but his eyes clear. He lifted his left forearm and showed her the tattoo again. "I got this the day after Fallujah," he said quietly. "I never knew your first name. Just your rank. Just that you carried me when you'd been shot yourself. I looked for you for 3 years. Natalie touched the tattooed letters gently, running her fingertip across the N. "I needed to disappear for a while," she said. "To heal." He nodded, understanding in a way that only someone who'd served could understand. "Did it work?" She looked at her son. At the SEALs. At the combat boots on the table, placed where the entire world could see them. "It's working now," she said. That evening, she walked through the ICU. The same corridors where she'd moved invisible for months. But something had changed. When she passed the nurses' station, they stood straighter. When she stopped to look at a chart, they moved to help without being asked. No one called her just a nurse anymore. No one whispered about her behind her back. She stopped at the bedside of the SEAL patient, who'd been admitted to the ICU for monitoring despite his improvement. His vitals were stable. O2 sat at 98%. Heart rate regular, rhythm normal. She checked his foresight, adjusted the medication infuser by exactly 0.3 milliliters per hour, precise, practiced, the kind of small decision that made the difference between comfort and discomfort. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I'm being taken care of by the best trauma nurse in North Carolina," he said. She allowed herself a small smile. "You're going to be fine. You're going to go back to the team. And you're going to remember that sometimes healing takes time, and sometimes it requires asking for help. From you. From whoever you trust," Natalie said. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. The ventilators wheezed their rhythmic breath. The monitors beeped their steady cadence. It was the same ICU. The same environment. The same institutional machinery that had tried to erase her. But Natalie Hayes was no longer invisible. She was the director of emergency medicine. She was a senior chief petty officer. She was the woman who'd saved a Navy SEAL's life twice, once in the chaos of Fallujah, once in the controlled precision of an ICU, when everyone around her was too afraid or too invested in their own authority to do what was necessary. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or judged by someone who didn't know your actual strength, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear that true power comes from integrity, not titles. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever worked with someone whose quiet competence changed everything? I'd love to hear your story.